Hi there. Welcome to the Sam Sorbo Show. On today's show, Alex Newman talks about the Great Reset, teaching compliance, and evil movie villains. Stay tuned. I think you're going to like it. Hi, I'm Sam Sorbo. You've heard me talk about Mike Lindell, who I adore. You know, he's the inventor of My Pillow, and how that pillow has given me a good night's sleep that I need. In fact, I never knew how good I could sleep before I had my Pillow. Mike continues to roll out new offers on his products, and the latest one is on his towel sets. Towels aren't something you think about often. I never knew what I was missing until I tried the towels just last year. Now, you have all helped build My Pillow into the incredible company that it is today, and you've trusted Mike Lindell to give you a great night's sleep. Mike's now changing the game with his 6-piece towel set. The set's made with USA cotton, making it extremely absorbent, and yet still providing that soft feel you look for in a towel. The set comes with 2 bath, 2 hand towels, and 2 washcloths, typically retailing for $109.99. But for a limited time, you can get this set for the low price of $39.99. And that's using promo code Sam Sorbo. So remember, all My Pillow products come with a 60-day money-back guarantee. You just go to mypillow.com, click on the radio listener specials to get this insanely low price of $39.99 on the towel set. You'll find deep discounts on other My Pillow products as well. So enter promo code Sam Sorbo, or you can call 800-625-5983. That's 800-625-5983 for these great radio specials. I want to invite you all to join me at the Playbook for Home Learning Conference put on by Underground Education. There's a new community that started online called the Underground Education Community. You can find it by going to samsorbo.com. You can also find all the information about the conference, about how to approach education with your kids. Times are hard for parents right now. There's a lot going on in the schools that we don't like. But I'll tell you something, home learning is easier than you ever thought it could be and more fun than you ever imagined. So join me at the Your Playbook for Home Learning Conference this June 24-25 in Port St. Lucie, Florida. And we're going to have a great time. Go to samsorbo.com for more information on everything. I'll see you there. Hey, welcome to the Sam Sorbo Show. I'm here with a special guest, Alex Newman. He's a lecturer, speaker. He's also an author. He's the father of 4 and counting 5 children now, Alex?
5 now, yep.
5 now, with a wonderful woman who happens to be Swedish. It's almost my favorite kind of person because I love speaking Swedish. And I speak Swedish with her kids, which is just with their kids, I should say, which is a lot of fun. Alex is very big in the space of getting kids out of public school, that obviously homeschooling, but more importantly, just getting them out of public school. And so on that, we are on the same team. But I recently heard him talking about the Great Reset and what the World Economic Forum is doing. And I thought it'd be very interesting to have him on to have a conversation about that and dive into it a little bit. You Alex, you explain it in very basic terms that make it very easy for people to understand. And I imagine that maybe a few people in my audience, maybe many, really haven't heard it in such sort of easy to grasp terms. So why don't we just start with that very broad question? What is the Great Reset and what are we sort of dealing with these days?
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Sam. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic. I should add that my kids said, "Oh my goodness, how does she speak such good Swedish?" And it's pretty amazing. It's true. They were fascinated because they never met an American who spoke Swedish, so they were really fascinated by that, and they were really impressed. But the Great Reset, Sam, it's hard to explain it in a short amount of time. In fact, when they unveiled this idea to the world, it took them almost 8 hours. It was at the World Economic Forum back in 2020. Now, Klaus Schwab, of course, has been contemplating this for decades, but the simplest way to understand it is a total transformation of everything. And when I say everything, I mean absolutely everything. The business world needs to change, economics, law, government. He calls for what he describes as a new social contract, a new relationship between the individual and the state. He calls for really a fundamental reorganization of the economy away from free markets where companies have shareholders and the board of directors is basically responsible for increasing shareholder value and satisfying the needs and wants of consumers or whoever their clients are, and shifting that toward what they describe as environmental, social, and governance. It's basically, as far as I'm concerned, a fascistic system where technically private property owners still own the businesses, but instead of doing what businesses have traditionally done, they do very much like what they've done in fascist economies like Italy and Germany. They obey the decrees of the state, in this case having to do with environment, social justice, governance, etc. And I think one of the most important changes that's going to be brought about by the Great Reset, if these people succeed, to hear Klaus Schwab and his buddies tell it, is actually a transformation of the human being himself or herself. They're quite literally promoting this idea of merging man and machine, of upgrading the human being through genetic engineering. And they're saying this quite openly. As you pointed out, Sam, most Americans have not heard of this. It hasn't yet entered the public marketing phase. But if you listen to the way they talk to each other, they're literally talking about implantable technology. They're talking about connecting human beings and the human body directly to the technological world. And that's where they're going with this. That's what they say they're planning.
I think it wasn't it Schwab who just came out recently and said, in the future, you will own nothing and you will be happy.
Yeah. The World Economic Forum, which Klaus Schwab founded and leads, put out this very bizarre video pretty recently around the time of the Great Reset propaganda. And they had, they described them as 8 predictions for the year 2030, but a much more realistic way of describing this is 8 agenda items that the World Economic Forum has. The very first one was, you will own nothing and you'll be happy. And then I thought it was interesting because we will own nothing, Sam, and the listeners out there, we get to own nothing. But then the very next prediction is that you're going to have to rent everything. So obviously somebody's got to own it.
Somebody's owning it.
Right. When you rent a rental car, you rent it from the rental car company, which owns the car.
Right. But Alex, because they're owning it, they will be the not happy. And by the way, we're going to redefine the word happy also.
Well, and they're serious. I mean, they actually talk about we need to end the system of gross domestic product, and they want to move toward a new metric. And this is serious. They've been pushing this at the United Nations. They've even had whole countries that have shifted to a new system. So instead of gross domestic product, where you add up, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and then net exports, they have now gross domestic happiness, where the government will define happiness, the government will order you to be happy, and you will comply.
Okay. Sorry. I actually had not heard that part.
It's true. Yep.
I mean, I wrote my book on words and how they're just taking our words and changing their meanings and then sort of throwing them in our faces. And that's literally what they're trying to do with the Great Reset. So how are they proposing going about accomplishing the Great Reset?
Well, that is the $50 billion question. And if you listen to Klaus Schwab, and actually when he unveiled the Great Reset, it wasn't just Klaus Schwab. And for people to understand, Klaus Schwab is an enormously powerful man. He's got, dictators, presidents, billionaires, CEOs of all the big corporations. They're all part of his little World Economic Forum. He brags about his young global leaders forum has penetrated every government in the world.
Do you know what? Just pause on that for a minute, because he did say Justin Trudeau is one of his protege.
Yep. Vladimir Putin.
Putin, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, currently. Yep.
Emmanuel Macron, the president of France.
Macron, right. So in a sense, I mean, if we're to take him seriously, which I think we should, he's got his tentacles pretty deep. And what do you make of Putin? By the way,
Putin is an interesting case. I believe that he's been very closely working with the same forces that are pushing this great reset. At the moment, he, at least on the surface of things, seems to be kind of on the outs. And it's entirely possible that they've betrayed each other somewhere. Maybe Putin stabbed them in the back. Maybe they stabbed him in the back. That's how these people do, right? I think the way to understand this group of global predators, gangsters, if you will, is really to imagine a mafia, except that they're worse than a mafia, right? At least mafia people, they have certain ethical standards, right? They don't murder each other's wives and children, right? Exactly. You don't kill the guy's wife and his kids. You shoot him when he's going to work or something. These global predators, they don't have any such compunctions. And so it's entirely possible that Putin tried to betray them and they're going after him or something. But I think more realistically, they've understood for a long time. You asked, how are they planning to bring about the Great Reset? They always use crises to bring this about. And so when they announced the Great Reset, it was in the context of the COVID crisis, or as Klaus Schwab puts it, the COVID crisis. The COVID-19 requires us to change everything. So he brought out the head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, a socialist. He brought out the head of the International Monetary Fund, a Bulgarian communist named Kristalina Georgieva, and the heir to the British throne. And so I think war is another component of that. You need to destroy the old system, the old order, before you can build a new one. So when Biden talks about build back better, which is a big component of the Great Reset, well, you can only build back better if you first destroy the thing that you're planning to build back better. So war is a very powerful tool for them. They've understood this, Sam, for at least 100 years, right? World War I destroyed everything, and what happened? Total transformation of society. You had the birth of the League of Nations, which they were hoping to kind of turn into their global governance structure. It didn't work out because the U.S. Senate said no. But then you had World War II. They got the United Abominations. The United Nations. You got the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all these things. And actually, in the early 1960s, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, very powerful group. All these U.S. elites and on both sides of the aisle are very involved with this group. And so is Klaus Schwab, incidentally. He first announced the Fourth Industrial Revolution in their magazine. But he put it on paper in a report for the State Department called "The World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations." That was his task. How do we get from where we are to a world effectively controlled by the UN? And his conclusion was very simple. Crises, war, and the threat of war are the fastest way to move us from where we are now, a world of independent sovereign nation states, to this world effectively controlled by the UN. So I think what's happening in Ukraine and Russia should really be viewed in that context. Zelensky, the head of Ukraine, is of course also deeply involved with the World Economic Forum. He's spoken there. He's got his bio page there. He's fully on board with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So I think crisis is the simple answer, Sam.
Do you think that the war that Putin started it, right? I mean,
absolutely.
So do you think that is actually a step towards this reset?
I do.
Intentionally, it really has. So in other words, it has very little to do with Ukraine. Like where Ukraine ends up is sort of anybody's guess, but destabilizing is really what he's trying to bring about.
That's exactly what I believe, Sam. And
right
I
now
think
it's somebody pretty well focused. And I know that we've got, I see in my community, I've got people, waving Ukrainian flags. And, I know that Ukraine is not like this innocent bystander, it's the seat of so much corruption. The U.S. mafia, political mafia, has had their hands in that cookie bin for quite a while. It's money laundering, and we send them billions of dollars. So I don't know that Ukraine is sort of this innocent bystander, but I also can't make excuses for Putin because he's Putin, right?
Well, I think what's happening, Sam, is exactly what you described, a destabilization operation. If you look at Putin's history, he has been very close to a guy called Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is, of course, one of the leading front men for this agenda, if you will. And he speaks very regularly and very publicly on this whole idea. We need a new world order. They've all got these crazy accents, like some kind of Bond villain. So we need a new world order. And Putin and Henry Kissinger are like two peas in a pod. They're good buddies. Putin actually explains in his autobiography that Kissinger is his mentor. They go to each other's houses for dinner. They have this bizarre relationship, and Kissinger actually outlined what he described as the strategy for world order in a book called World Order. And what he said is you've got to have these regional orders built up in all the different regions of the world. And so Putin, of course, is following that to a T. He's building what's called the Eurasian Union, trying to rebuild the Soviet bloc, if you will. He's got Kazakhstan, he's got Belarus, and some of these other former Soviet countries. But I think what's going to end up happening out of this conflict that we're seeing is a fundamental restructuring, a transformation of the previous world order. And for almost a decade now, they've been talking about the shift away from a unipolar world order where the United States is the sole unchallengeable global hegemon, to what they describe as a multipolar world order, where there's all these different poles of power, including Beijing, including Moscow, including maybe the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India. So I think when this is all over, it's going to look like the United States government scored the most spectacular own goal in all of history. It's probably going to end with the US dollar in significant trouble. It's been used as the global reserve currency since World War II. Even after we dropped the gold backing, it was backed by oil, so-called the petrodollar. So I think we're coming to that system is coming to a close, and it's going to be really a dramatic transformation. And I think that crisis scenario, economic crisis combined with war crisis, combined with political crisis, combined with, who knows, another pandemic, right? Bill Gates is running around blabbering about the next pandemic, will cause such an upheaval in the world that people will be ready to accept just anything. Just please make it stop. Please let the grocery stores be normal again. Please let my kids be able to go to school again. Please just make all this craziness stop. And then they'll accept, okay, well, we'll take this great reset if that's what it takes.
I was speaking, and this is just hearsay, rumor, and innuendo, right? But I was speaking with a young entrepreneurial gal who was being mentored by somebody, one of the higher ups over at Apple a few years back. And this gal is freedom-minded and conservative, but obviously wasn't sort of letting it all hang out. And she said to me that during that time, the mentor was saying things like, well, you better protect yourself. I try to get the entrepreneurs that I work with to protect themselves because it's going to be hard to keep a small business going. And so you need to take, you need to have strategies and ways to, in other words, in hindsight, she could see now that there was a prediction that there was going to be an attack on small business. If we've seen anything, we've seen how they've used COVID to attack small business. Small business is the engine of the United States. It's also the engine of our freedom, right? That we have individuals who are self-determining and not working for large corporations. They're working for themselves in a sense, right? And so now that we've seen this attack and we can appreciate it, what are we supposed to do? What would you say to that?
Well, I think you just hit on something that's huge, Sam. They have to break the back of the middle class, because the middle class is attached to its private property. In fact, private property is the foundation of our freedom. And as long as you have this independent mass of people in the United States, people who, like you said, don't have to answer to a big corporation. They don't have to worry about, what the shareholders on the New York Stock Exchange think. They have a major problem in that they can't get this through. And so I think that was one of the most obvious giveaways that something was very amiss with the response to COVID, right? How can it be that we can go get abortions, we can go to pot shops, we can go to liquor stores, and we can go to Walmart? Apparently COVID doesn't spread there. We can also go burn down our cities if we're carrying Black Lives Matter signs, but you can't go to a small business. You can't go to your local grocery store. You can't go to church. Right? The warning signs should have been flashing bright red. And I think that was right for everybody who was paying attention, who wasn't watching CNN. But I think that's the key. And then
the vaccine being quote unquote mandated for any business that employed 100 or more employees.
Yep.
Like what?
Yep.
How what's the scientific basis for that decision?
Well,
I
we
mean,
now know that clearly there was no scientific basis for any of this. In fact, the data shows very clearly now we've been deceived on such a massive scale. How many times did we hear that you just take it and you're protected? Well, now the data shows very clearly that if you took it, you're more likely to get the COVID. You're more likely to end up in the hospital. You're more likely to die from COVID. That's what the British government's data is showing. They've got some of the best data in the world because everybody's part of the government healthcare system. They've
yeah,
got
but I
perfect
don't know if
records.
I don't know if you saw they've stopped actually recording the data.
Yeah, it was too
They've just,
embarrassing.
we're just
People
gonna,
might want a refund. How many billions did you spend on Pfizer? Hey, get that money back, please.
yeah, that this is, and here's where so this is where this is the departure point for me. I'm not sure what to call it. It's a flexion point for me because they win either way. So we should be bringing lawsuits. We should be holding people accountable, right? The chaos, the mayhem that will bring will also serve to further the New World Order agenda, right?
Yeah. And that's what they're so good at doing, at giving us two choices where heads, you lose, tails, they win, right? So hey, you can follow this leader and it's controlled opposition. Hey, you could take this route and it leads to the same place. They're just absolute masters of doing that. It's very concerning. And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in now. Almost any outlet we have for responding to this, we're backing ourselves into a corner.
So talk to me about Twitter. I think if we can, Elon Musk basically made a play to buy Twitter at a very generous price, and the forces are arrayed against him because they're so afraid of his libertarian values. So called, right? And so here's the thing. The thing that people have to realize is there's only one reason to stop someone from speaking, and that's because whatever they're saying so contradicts what you're saying and dismantles it, right? It threatens what you're saying. If what you're saying is true, there's no reason to silence any opposition because the truth will prevail. So that's made me a super skeptic, because the moment that they try to silence it, I'm more inclined to believe it. What about you?
I agree 100%. And I think Twitter is actually a perfect example of the kind of company they want under this new model that they're bringing about with the Great Reset, the ESG, right? Under normal circumstances, a board of directors has a fiduciary obligation to do what's in the best interest of shareholders. Now, I would, if I owned Twitter stock, I would have sued those clowns so fast their heads would spin. How in the world can you say it's in the best interest of your shareholders to ban your most popular user, right? They literally banned the most popular user on their platform, of course, Donald Trump, because they didn't like what he was saying. And of course, many people went with Donald Trump. When he was kicked off the platform, that was the main reason a lot of people were there. They said, okay, I'm out of here. What happened? The number of eyeballs staring at your platform, staring at the advertisements, shrank dramatically. The amount of data they were gathering and stealing on their users shrank dramatically. How do you justify that from a business perspective? And of course, you can't. Instead, you have to justify it from the ESG perspective. Well, it wasn't socially responsible for us to allow this crazy right-wing extremist, homophobic, sexist, racist president, whatever they want to call him, to be allowed to speak freely on the platform because it might hurt somebody's feelings. So that's the kind of company they want. They're not so much worried about making profit, doing things that companies are supposed to do. They're worried about manipulating you and controlling you.
Why didn't anybody bring suit?
That's a good question. I have no idea, because if I had owned shares in Twitter, I would have been the first one at the front of the line saying, look, that's not in the best interest of shareholders. Y'all have some explaining to do.
Yeah. And by the way, why is the I can't think of his name now, the leader in Iran still on the platform?
Right. And the Taliban and the Chi-Coms. That's amazing.
It's like there's no, and but here's what's the shining, maybe the silver lining, is that people are noticing this. Are you familiar with the nudge theory?
Oh, yes. In fact, one of Barack Hussein Obama's key people, Cass Sunstein, was a big proponent of this. We don't necessarily want to order people to do stuff, but if we can nudge them in the direction of doing what we want to do, it'll be more effective. And that's what they're doing on a massive scale.
Do you want to explain it to the listeners and viewers? What is the nudge theory?
Sure. Well, Cass Sunstein, who was the regulatory czar during the Obama administration, the guy was a fruitcake of the highest order. He wanted to, ban conspiracy theories. He wanted to put a tax on ideas that are not acceptable being floated around on the internet. So he finally came to the conclusion that just using brute force was not the way to accomplish the objectives that he. And again, if you look into this guy's legal track record, he is a fruitcake of the highest order. He thinks that whales should have rights and should be able to sue in the courts. I mean, total bonkers ideas.
You're not saying Welsh people, you mean whales, the mammals that swim in the sea.
And so he thinks that the animals need to be able to sue in court. And I mean, the guy is just so far out there, and yet he's incredibly influential. And so he puts out this book outlining his ideas on nudging people, and makes the case that really it'll be much more effective to implement our policies if we don't just mandate it. We just kind of force people to do it through nudges. You kind of paint them into a corner where they're going to end up doing what you want them to do, but you don't have to necessarily point a gun at their face. They'll just end up doing it because it's the only option that they think they have. And that's where they're going with this.
Yeah. So I believe the originator of the nudge theory was a guy named Thaler, Thaleer. And he wrote a book about the idea that rather than openly coercing people, you can nudge them, and that's actually more effective because in a sense, you allow them the illusion that they are deciding for themselves. But there's also the Ash experiment, and I just read this on an Igor Chudov thread on Substack. There's the Ash experiment where they proved that 62.5% of the time, if the entire group believes in, and it doesn't have to be the truth, it believes in a blatant lie, the one person who is part of the group who has not been, how do I say? So the experiment was they put one person in a room full of other people who he thought were just honest brokers, but they were all part of the experiment. And so they all went along with this lie. And the one person who was the actual subject of the experiment agreed to go along with the lie, basically to be in the group think 62.5% of the time. Well, the day before they started mandating vaccines, we had reached 62.3% of the vaccine rate had reached 60. Like it's 62.3%, 62.5% in the Ash experiment. The idea being that if everybody's jumping off the bridge, the odds are you're not going to stand up and say, hey folks, don't jump off the bridge. But there are people out there who are still free enough thinkers. And to bring this sort of a little bit full circle between you and me, Alex, I maintain that we are all school injured, in that if we attended school, we were trained so forcefully to conform that it's very difficult for us to stand up and say, no, I think you're all wrong and I'm the only right one, but I actually firmly believe that I'm right enough to actually make a stand. I think it's become so difficult for people to do that. So when they said 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I said, okay, but then they said slow the spread. And I said, well, wait a minute, what about speed the spread? Did anybody give that a thought? Like, you know what I mean? So I learned very early that I was somebody who questioned the narrative. I'm always questioning whatever narrative. I just question it. I poke holes in it, and that helps me verify, right? I'm a big fan of trust but verify. So
amen.
But we're living in a culture where we're predisposed, apparently just naturally predisposed to a 62.5% conformity rate. by nature. And then I think the schools pile on to that. So I think we're probably higher than that now, just by training. I call it school injured, frankly.
Yeah, that's a great term. And I think that's exactly what we're dealing with, Sam. And on this idea of not using coercion, in fact, we're watching this play out in real time in communist China. Now, we know the Communist Chinese Party is not concerned about using force. I mean, they've literally slaughtered 100 million people, not including the unborn babies that they've slaughtered, which is hundreds of millions more. So they're not reluctant to use force and terrorism and violence. But they have figured out, interestingly enough, that the hardcore coercion is less effective than the model that they are now pursuing. They call it the social credit system. And I first reported this back in 2015. People are like, no way. Well, it's here. Right? Every Chinese citizen has a number, and they are all of this data is being vacuumed up by the regime. Do you pay your mortgage on time? Are you friends with subversives on social media? Have you ever questioned the government? Is your phone normally charged up when it should be? And all of this gets compiled, and through algorithms, it calculates what your score is, your social credit score. And so everybody then is doing their best to do what they think the regime wants them to do, not because there's a gun pointed at their head, but because if your credit score falls low enough, you won't be able to get on an airplane. You won't be able to get on a train. Your kids won't be able to go to school. You can't leave the country. And so the soft totalitarianism is now in place.
It's just a different kind of gun.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, you know, I know that you've been sounding the alarm on this for years now. And I mean, it started back in Common Core when they started here to record data. And there were a lot of people in the Common Core battle who were sort of sounding a warning sound that they're recording the data from your children as young as kindergarten, preschool. They start recording data, and we don't know where that data goes. And you sign off on that when you drop your kids off at school. And now they've moved testing online. And so the parents don't have access to see what the tests are. And I have actually seen some of the testing, and I'm sure you have too, where they ask things like, is there a gun in your home?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like things that shouldn't be on a test, or shouldn't, you know, they call social emotional learning. And we really ought to call it child abuse, because that's in large part what it is. Yep. And, you know, so it's you say they have soft tyranny over in China. It's so soft here, we don't feel it, but it's there. It just hasn't, the boom hasn't been lowered yet, right?
That's exactly right, Sam. And you're right too about the data. The data gathering is what feeds this system. It's what makes it possible. So they want to move away from the old model of self-government, where we have a constitution and we elect representatives, and those representatives represent us and supposedly do our will within the confines of the Constitution, right? We can't wake up and vote for somebody to shut down our neighbor's newspaper or you know, lynch somebody that we don't like. We've got the rule of law, but they're moving away from that model where we govern ourselves toward a technocratic model. And their justification for all this is, look, you know, we know central planning didn't work in Angola, in Mozambique, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in China, and Russia, et cetera. But now we've got all this data. And so now that's going to enable our computers and our experts to know just what should be done. And that's the model that they're moving toward. And so they're starting with the little children, gathering every kind of data you can imagine, and data you can't even imagine. They've got technology now, like the facial expression camera monitor that monitors your facial expressions in response to stimuli. And they say in reports from the Department of Education that I have saved on my computer, we're going to use all this data to create predictions about your child. What is your child going to believe when he or she grows up? How is your child going to behave? What are their skill sets going to be? And then they say, well, hey, this one is definitely not going to be suited to being a lawyer or a teacher because he's one of those conservative Christian troglodytes. But this will be well suited to being a university professor because this one has the right attitudes. That's where they're going with all this. It's like a dystopian sci-fi movie, and unfortunately, it's real.
Right, exactly. And it's Minority Report meets I can't even think of, but they've been doing this. So the data collection is sort of the new element in all of this. Schools have been funneling children into job paths for decades. And in fact, that should have been a tipping point for us a while ago. But the salami tactic, right? Slice by slice, the frog in the pot of water, and just turning up the heat. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. So what's uplifting, because we have to go now, we're running out of time. What can we leave the viewers and listeners with as a takeaway of something that they can do, or some way that they can prevent what seems to be inevitable in a sense?
Well, there's a lot of good news. God is still on the throne and God is sovereign. So these people who think they're going to achieve all of their objectives are sorely mistaken. That's very good news. And also, as far as what people can do, we can't necessarily, control what's happening in Washington. I mean, we have trouble controlling what's happening in City Hall and our state capitol, much less what's going on in Washington, D.C. But we can control what's happening in our family. We can pull our children out of these indoctrination centers that are preparing them, that are grooming them to be serfs in this great reset world abomination that they're trying to build. That's something that we can all do. We can all give our kids a great education. We can teach them how to think. We can teach them truth. We can teach them to love beauty. And I know you've been sounding the alarm on this for so long, Sam, but it sounds so simple, but it's so powerful. It transforms your life and your family and your children's lives. It's such a powerful way to resist this system. And right now, there's nothing anybody can do to stop you.
Yeah, and I love that. And that is the truth. In fact, the old adage is, if the voters won't vote for me, I'll just bring in different voters. Well, we need to create different voters in the United States, because it doesn't matter what we do politically in the long run. In the short run, yes, fight for the politics. But in the long run, if we don't change the culture from the child up, then the children that are going to be graduating in 20 years, they will be voting socialist, because that's what they're taught is good and holy in our public schools. So Alex Newman, people can find you at libertysentinel.org. You do a lot of speaking. I encourage people to invite Alex to come and speak to your church or your group, because you're phenomenal. And I could keep you here all day, but I'm not allowed to.
Well, I appreciate it so much, Sam. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm also a senior editor at the New American Magazine. I write regularly for the Epic Times. In fact, I did a whole series on education there that people might find interesting, including some stuff on the Great Reset. But
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sam, for all that you do. It's always a pleasure, and hopefully we'll chat again very soon.
Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks,
This
Sam.
is the Sam Sorbo Show.